SlaughterHouse Five, Chapter 1C. So we tried to ignore Mary and remember the war. I took a couple of belts above the booze I'd brought. We would chuckle or grin sometimes as the war stories were coming back, but neither one of us could remember anything good. O'Hare remembered one guy who got in a lot of wine in Dresden before it was bombed, and we had to take him home in a wheelbarrow. It was much to write a book about. I remembered two Russian soldiers who had looted a clock factory. They had a horse-drawn wagon full of clocks. They were happy and drunk. They were smoking huge cigarettes they had rolled in newspaper. That was about it for memories, and Mary was still making noise. She finally came out in the kitchen again for another Coke. She took another tray of ice cubes from the refrigerator, banged it in the sink even though there was already plenty of ice out. Then she turned to me, let me see how angry she was, and that the anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was a fragment of a much larger conversation. You were just babies then, she said. What? I said. You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs. I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. But you're not going to write it that way, are you? This wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I don't know, I said. Well, I know, she said. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra or John Wayne or some of those other glamorous war-loving dirty old men. And war will look just wonderful, so we'll have a lot more of them. And they'll be fought by babies just like the babies upstairs. So then I understood. It was war that made her so angry. She didn't want her babies or anybody else babies killed in wars, and she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. So I held up my right hand and I made her a promise. Mary, I said, I don't think this book of mine is ever going to be finished. I must have written 5,000 pages by now and thrown them all away. If I ever do finish it, though, I give you my word of honor, there won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. I tell you what, I said, I'll call it the Children's Crusade. She was my friend after that. O'Hare and I gave up on remembering, went into the living room, talked about other things. We became curious about the real Children's Crusade, so O'Hare looked it up in a book. He had Extraordinarily Popular Delusions and Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, LL.D. It was first published in London in 1841. Mackay had a low opinion of all crusades. The Children's Crusade struck him as only slightly more sordid than the 10 Crusades for grown-ups. O'Hare read this handsome passage out loud. History, in her solemn page, informs us that the Crusaders were but ignorant and savage men, that their motives were those of bigotry unmitigated, and that their pathway was one of blood and tears. Romance, on the other hand, dilates upon their piety and heroism and portrays in her most glowing and impassioned hues their virtue and magnanimity, the unperishable honor they acquired for themselves, and the great service they rendered to Christianity. And then O'Hare reads this. Now, what was the grand result of all these struggles? Europe expended millions of her treasures and the blood of 2 million of her people, and a handful of quarrelsome knights retained possessions of Palestine for about 100 years. Mackay told us that the Children's Crusade started in 1213, when two monks got the idea of raising armies of children in Germany and France and selling them in North Africa as slaves. 30,000 children volunteered thinking they were going to Palestine. They were no doubt idle and deserted children who generally swarm in great cities, nurtured on vice and daring, said Mackay, and ready for anything. Pope Innocent III thought they were going to Palestine too, and he was thrilled. These children are awake while we are asleep, he said. Most of the children were shipped out of Marseille, and about half of them drowned in shipwrecks. Another half got to North Africa, where they were sold through a misunderstanding. Some children reported for duty at Genoa, where no slave ships were waiting. They were fed and sheltered and questioned kindly by good people there, then given a little money and a lot of advice and sent back home. Hooray for the good people of Genoa, said Mary O'Hare. I slept that night in one of the children's bedrooms. O'Hare had put a book for me on the bedside table. It was Dresden, his history, stage, and gallery by Mary Endell. It was published in 1908, and its introduction began. It is hoped that this little book will make itself useful. It attempts to give an English reading public a bird's eye view of how Dresden came to look as it does architecturally, of how it expanded musically through the genius of a few men to its present bloom, and it calls attention to certain permanent landmarks in art that makes its gallery the resort of those seeking lasting impression. I read some history further on. Now in 1760, Dresden underwent